Hello and welcome to round 7 of the World Chess Championships between Ding Liren and Gukesh Maraju. Today Gukesh had white versus Ding's black. Let's see what Gukesh brought to the table. And, well, 3-all. He played the move, and knight f3, trying, once again, as indeed Ding tried himself with white, to play a semi-waiting move, the idea being to wait to see what black does. And also, as we'll see, can avoid certain move orders of certain variations of other openings. Often it transposes, as you would expect, because pawns can now move later on, and, well, we'll see what happens. So, d5 by Ding, very central, controlling the center. That's the downside of white playing this. They haven't committed a pawn yet, so black can just say, okay, I'll control the center. And g3, once again, sort of letting black stew, seeing what they'll do. They played g6, and it was commented often in setups against d4 and c4, Ding will often put the bishop over here, or perhaps here, or perhaps here. But obviously with g6, the preferred setup against g3 things, just setting up a counter fianchetto along these two long diagonals. Well, now Ding, of course, is having to put his bishop where maybe, as I think Gukesh's team had spotted, he doesn't often put it. Perfectly playable, but after d4, very quickly played by Gukesh, clearly having thought, okay, I'll go into Catalan-esque positions. And, well, after bishop g7, very symmetrical, c4. And it's important to just dwell on this moment because here, if we just go back and look at the main line of the Catalan with 1 d4, d5, c4, e6, and knight f3, knight f6, and g3, we reach this same position, but of course, unlike in today's game where g6, bishop g7 has been played, this gives rise to various moments where d takes e4 is possible, bishop e4 check is also possible, and just by way of an example, the main line of such goes like so, where both sides castle, and black can then take on c4, Ding, Gukesh even, clearly trying to avoid going into a mainline Catalan, which Ding Liren certainly would be very, very well prepared against such openings. As a result, if we go back to the game at this moment, we see a very different setup by black, where, having played g6, well, we'll see after c4, this is still possible and it's very topical, but c6, just preparing to blunt the bishop in all future scenarios of d takes c4, and indeed preparing for a potential pawn chain, where this can be annoying, but if black can play moves like bishop b7, even rook a7, with an a5 push, queen b6 or c7 to defend, then black can just win a pawn. However, it is not quite that simple, because in winning this pawn, white, as we'll see, will often get two pawns, very centralized, controlling a lot of space here with definite attacking potential. So Gukesh clearly aiming for something like that. And indeed, after knight f6, developing, very sensible, defending, often, as we're seeing here, it's very symmetrical in this so-called Neo-Grunfeld structure. Therefore, castles, castles. And now various moves have been tried. I've actually had this position myself where knight c3, c takes d5, queen b3 in various combinations all make a lot of sense, where white uses the fact they're up a move, develops their queen, attacks, maybe attacks here as well, with or without keeping the tension with cd, cd. And it's just a game. There's a reason both sides play it. It's perfectly playable for both sides. However, Gukesh, having avoided mainline Catalans, as we just mentioned, well, they played the move rook e1. Very interesting move, completely bemusing all commentators, though this is incredibly rare. And, well, it comes with one specific idea, to play e4 without being sort of babysat by the queen or the knight, and not committing with knight c3 very notably, potentially, as we'll see, to come to d2, where it could win back the pawn more easily, whereas with knight takes c3, d takes e4, e4, b5, typically seen here, and obviously with this knight on c3 committed, as opposed to in the game rook e1, much harder to win back c4. So that's one key difference. And it sent Ding into a quite thoughtful think, because at this moment, after rook e1, he had 1 hour 55, and he went down to 1 hour 27 with d takes e4, which, once again, Ding goes into the tank and thinks and comes out with a pretty good approach, seeing that he can take on c4 with this pawn blockade of this bishop, blunting it should be okay. There followed e4, grabbing the aforementioned space. And at this moment, well, Ding launched out with bishop g4, a very sensible move. And knight bd2, the benefit of not committing with knight c3 and having achieved with the rook this space. Of course, although this is pinned, queen takes d4 simply loses a bishop because the knight survives and the bishop doesn't, and will be defended by the rook if this further sacrifice happens. So, very stable defended center by all pieces, all hands on deck. And if b5, well, Ding got cold feet on this idea because, for example, h3, firstly, and this happened in a different variation in the game, if bishop takes knight and knight takes bishop on f3, suddenly, yes, this is an extra pawn, but it's very immobile. This is more to allow the rook some space than anything else, but it does also grab some space over here. But white has a lot of fun with moves like e5, knight d5, very slow but steady, push, push, push. And if these don't do too much, then it's not really a worthwhile extra pawn. c3 is available in some variations, but for example now just doesn't look too great because after captures, knight takes, the knight's in hot water and black's not developed yet. And it potentially doesn't achieve too much regardless, and what black has to take time in any case. Like this, and h5, there's definite play here for white. Alternatively, if the bishop retreats to e6 perhaps, then just a4, a5, and queen e2, and white sits behind their very strong center. Once again, these relatively immobile pawns, if worth noting, if ever they do this, then black loses their pawn, extra pawn, and e4 might well drop in this variation. But things like that definitely make it tricky to push the pawn. And indeed, if you just incept a move like knight g5 first in this specific position, then kicking the bishop off, allowing queen or knight takes c4, then the same sorts of things happen, but without losing your two pawns. So very hard to maneuver these pawns for various reasons, whereas these are a bit safer than black's pawns. And, well, that's why we say play in the center. Makes a lot more sense. Well, in this position, Ding decided to play c5, a bit of a risky move, discounting b5 over striking back at the center, which does make some sense, to say the least. But after d5, notably the first moment where Gukesh had to start thinking, he spent about 8 minutes, 7 minutes on this move, pushing in the center, declining to undouble these pawns. Of course, if captures, well, then just knight a6 and you've gifted a very quick development to the d3 square. You're never holding this pawn. You might win this, but that's the extent of it. After knight to c5, for example, it's just level 4 pawns versus 4 pawns, 2v2, equal pieces, nothing much for white. So d5, keeping these doubled, and after e6, striking back once again, not letting white just solidify. If white gets time, just a couple of tempi to solidify. Maybe move the knight back to e3, bishop to here, pinning, queen d2 perhaps, h3 to win the bishop pair. You know, this bishop, the bishop pair could be very useful. The typical Catalan bishop showing its power. Then white would be pretty well placed. So e6 strikes, compels, perhaps h3 to at least win the bishop pair. And after bishop takes, pawn takes, pawn takes. Worth noting, at this moment, knight takes d5 is too hot to touch. Knight takes c4, and this is destined to be too problematic. They can blockade with bishop d4, and at least not lose a piece, or maybe the exchange. But after bishop h6, if rook to here, then just bishop takes d5, because this queen is overloaded from the defense. And so we've won the exchange, essentially. Bishop g7, once again, d5 drops, and therefore black just needs to get on with it and develop and lose the exchange in a lot of variations. Perhaps king takes or queen takes. Not possible because of bishop takes d5. For that reason, black cannot take on d5, and so just develop, getting your pieces out to the party in the middle makes a lot more sense. And white does just that as well. Looking down here now, in typical Grunfeld and Neo-Grunfeld, as this opening more precisely was, style, b5 now saw itself on the board, forcing the knight to retreat, Gukesh chose to come back to here and strike at the pawn. The reasoning being, well, it's just going to be in the way if it comes over here, especially d2. That would be blocking the bishop, and on e3, it's not really doing anything. It's very defensive, and where's it? It's going to c2 anyway. Meanwhile, it's blocking various things and specifically allowing knight e5 in this position, which is a little bit annoying, giving an obvious outpost, an octopus knight on d3. So for that reason, after b5, there's no other decent square. d6 does nothing and is just begging to be kicked away, and would have to go back anyway. So a3 it was, and after queen b6, just solidifying this, we reach a very dynamic position where black is defending their pawns and is a clearly offensive position here. White's 2 pawns in the center have evaporated, but having won the pawn back and also having opened it up for their newly won bishop pair, we will see that we have a little lovely trident here on the board where that could be very, very powerful, striking down at the black queen side. And as we'll see, after bishop f4, perhaps bishop e3 as well is a potential possibility to strike for b4, rook c1 in some order. But Gukesh chose bishop f4, just setting up their bishop pair, very powerful asset here. And, well, yes, this pawn does need to be defended, but it's a pass pawn and could, in the long run, be very, very powerful, as we may well see. It's worth noting as well, if b4, this sort of begs for knight c4 to happen. And yes, there's queen b5, but a move like rook c1, b3, solidifying the structure, even knight d6 immediately now starts. It's defended now, it's much stronger than it was. And where's this queen going? Back to here. Well, it's going to get very, very tricky with the back rank being guarded through both the knight and x-rays. There's only d8, and it's not that useful with this knight. Also, on d7, where is it going as well? So this would be a very unfavourable moment to push b4 because knight c4 just jumps back. So the knight on a3, kind of paralysing these pawns. If either one pushes up, b4, then knight c4, and if c4, then just b3 striking, or bishop e3. All of the above really makes these pawns quite immobile once again. So good counterplay, but the downside is, of course, unable to use it too much for now. And that makes sense with the bishop pair, x-raying down, black's in a bit of a tight spot. White has definitely got a decent position, possibly even won the opening battle post-opening. Rook e8, and after a sensible queen developing move, knight e4 is not possible, so it's a very good queen placement. Looking down, possibly h4, h5, as is typical of the Catalan. And now rook d8, centralizing, and knight back to c2. And it's an interesting moment because around here, well, this knight's certainly gone around the houses all the way back to c2, but now b4 is defended, and b4 by white is definitely a pawn break on the horizons. And here, well, this is where it started to spell danger for Ding. He played knight f8, which is potentially trying to use the pin, but as we'll see, to no avail. Instead, he perhaps should trade the rooks, play knight e8 to d6, blockade the pawn, like his life depends on it. And of course, the knight behind a passed pawn is blocked by a lot of attack, only the bishop, of course, but it's defended. So that would have been a very good plan. And for example, king g2, knight d6. Firstly, if rook e7, just bishop f6 evicts it immediately. And yeah, this is very much no good. Meanwhile, if a sensible move like b3 just to get off of this, he always has bishop f6 to cover e7 and defend. And the pawn's blockaded, black's pieces sort of shuffle around behind it. The rook could come to e8 in the long run. And there's potential knight to here. It's covered for now, but definitely looking at that square a lot to at least prevent white from achieving it. This is stopped. A move like b4, threatening bishop c3. White's possibly slightly better, but this would have been very playable and just a very dynamic game. It was a dynamic game in the way the game went. However, after knight f8, well, this pin is useful, but b4 immediately striking. Firstly, if this, nipping this in the bud, just bishop e3, and Gukesh is semi-winning because of this pin. Just very, very tough. Everything needs to lurch backwards and defend. That would have been no good. And instead, since knight e6 is not possible, well, as we'll see, this knight doesn't enjoy itself on f8. Therefore, it's c4. If captures, then knight takes b4, and there's a knight hopping in. Too many things. An octopus knight just doing too many things, and also it opens up play against b5. So that would have been very antithetical to what black wanted, with the bishop pair as well, raining down on the queen side. Very unpleasant. Opening up, so c4 makes a lot of sense. Closing it down, protected past pawn. However, there's squares behind and that have been left behind, and also this can be blockaded. And after bishop e3, there followed queen a6, bishop d4, solidifying this, and also meaning that there's a bunch of issues with bishop takes g7 if ever black tries to win the pawn on d5. So that's not possible. For example, as happened in the game, rook takes, diverging from the game briefly. If knight takes here, simply bishop takes g7, and the king's going to be on the long diagonal, a weakness, and also this is double attacked, with a knight e3 helping to defend in, for example, captures, and there we have it, completely safe. Aside from the fact there's even a getaway check from the pin. Instead, the rooks did come off, but of course Ding did not blunder with knight takes d5. Ding should have challenged for the open file, and after rook e8, very likely seeing some kind of trade-off with the knight coming to d6. On the other hand, black could have been forced to capture as well. Either way, the rook's likely to trade off, so do the bishops, and black has to risk this position where the pawn's blockaded, but there's definite chances for white. There's also definite chances for black. White's slightly better, but well, playable, to say the least. However, Ding went in for a pawn grab on a2, and feel free to pause the video. There's a very interesting moment after rook a1. What would you play as black after rook a1? Ding being short on time, 17 minutes for 17 moves. Almost pre-moved queen b3. It's very logical. There's not really seemingly no other choice. However, pawn c3 would have been a very interesting tactical resource where, firstly, attacking the queen. So if rook takes a2, pawn takes, and of course, very powerful. And very likely this pawn will trade off for this pawn, and then black's possibly even doing better there. Or if the pawn is taken with the queen, knight takes d5, and the unlocking of this Grunfeld position is very, very powerful. And ultimately, after rook takes, this would be too much for this bishop. White would be fine, but so would black. And if bishop takes, it allows the key point, the c4 square, from pushing this pawn. c4 is now vacated. Because of the pressure on d5, white might well need to do this and nab the a7 pawn. White's pawn up, but with this pressure, the pin, the knight coming out, this should be pretty good for black, at least holdable, and not too much worse. However, having captured this pawn, Ding played queen b3, and there followed rook a3, defending the bishop, queen b1 check, king g2. Now here, Ding played rook d7, a very logical move to perhaps patrol the 7th rank, but the computer points out that knight 6 d7 might have been a better try. The point being, white can and should take on a7, but if they try to twofold, perhaps there's the additional option from the bishop coming to c3 of c3. And the point being that if captures, then this trades off. And we see another position where the two knights need to face off versus the bishop and knight, where they can blockade, they still have a 2 versus 1. Definite chances to hold a draw, and yeah, not a terrible position. So that's an interesting moment, knight 6 d7. Notably not possible if knight 8 d7, because the same thing happening. Of course, black can go back, but c3 is now not an option at all. And after bishop takes c3, then queen c4, and the queen's bullied back quite significantly after, like so. Of course, Gukesh was not accepting a threefold. Fortune certainly favours the bold. And so after rook a3, queen b1, king g2, rook d7, Gukesh played rook a5. He briefly two-folded Ding Liren just to double check that this was a good idea, and also there's no harm in just taking time to make sure the decision is correct. And notably, what was a huge time advantage, Gukesh, having just a few moves ago been over 20 minutes, was now down to 16 minutes, roughly level with Ding Liren. So clearly that factored in, and after rook takes b5, suddenly Ding is in real danger. The knight f8 move, coupled with the queen takes pawn, has gifted white a lot of activity and a lot of targets in black's position. So after queen d3, well, there's a few different attempts, but keeping the queens on could well have made a lot of sense. Certainly preserving the bishop pair, because as happens, generally when you're facing the bishop pair, you want to trade off one of them so that the remaining can only control the 32 coloured squares it's patrolling, in this case the light squared bishop. So bishop e3 could have been a very nice move. Queen takes, pawn, bishop takes. This is defended versus two attackers. Two defenders, two attackers. And this knight can come to e3. Defend, attack. Rook c5 to really patrol the c4 pawn. All in all, very decent chances. Once again, this knight on f8, complete nightmare for black. Totally trapped on the f8 square. However, Gukesh, getting a little bit low on time, played queen to f4 even. And after queen takes c2, there followed bishop takes and queen f5. And these were all very natural moves by Gukesh, because now he traded queens and wagered that maybe with these weaknesses, indeed he said it in the press conference, he made the assumption that with these two, coupled with potentially at least one passed pawn and one not so safe a7 pawn, he should be winning. However, there's some life in black's position, because unlike in, we'll go back to in a moment, when the bishop pair are on, this king can hide on the dark squares, and if that knight can just jump, as there are some opportunities to do, to the d6 square, then it's very hard for a bishop, blocked by its own pawn, to evict this knight. And I was saying to a pupil just this past week, in terms of putting pawns on the coloured square of the bishop, it often depends on whether the bishop can use them as targets. Of course, bishops like are very good at playing on both sides of the board, and if they can make targets of these pawns, then obviously not so much do you want the pawns on the same coloured squares. However, if the pawns can control a lot of the squares, which they somewhat do now, and meanwhile, because of the activity of the rook, perhaps this bishop isn't so great at targeting this. And indeed, as we'll see, the king is defending a lot of them. This pawn's actually a lot harder to win than you'd expect an a7 with the activity of the rook. I guess what I'm saying is the fact that white has a bishop and it's a bit stuck, and the fact that it can't easily or conveniently get round to attack without kings defending, maybe means that these pawns are less targets and more bollards in the way of that bishop. And, well, let's see what happened, because black has very decent chances on dark squares. Very briefly, that contrasts with perhaps the move bishop g5, where, say, if the queens come off, this bishop pair, once again, raining down on the queen side, c3, rook c5, that pawn's going nowhere, this knight is still terrible, and just by having the additional bishop, well, it makes it more imbalanced. There's definitely more chances for black with this bishop in some positions, but there's also more chances for white. So a little possibly an inaccurate guesstimation of the position, but they were both low on time and very tricky. And aesthetically, this pawn, or if we come back to here, on f5, well, yes, the bishop's off, but this pawn on f5 does look aesthetically like a weakness, and white still has the hugely better of it, worth noting that. But with the bishop pair, perhaps that was an opportunity that would have really got a semi-winning position, as opposed to this position where not quite as good as what could have been. In any case, rook c5, same idea, and black has a lot of work to do. Everything I've just pointed out really requires extreme resilience from Ding Liren. Let's see if he makes it. Then g6, the other benefit of this is the knight can find new life on g6. Rook takes. Knight e5, forking. Now it's worth noting, if captures, because this king comes to f4. After, for example, rook d6 blockading, king f4, king f6, even h4, h5, rook d1, rook's behind the passed pawn. Black is in zugzwang. There's pretty much nothing that can be played after a6, just mark time again, and something has to give. Black has to move the king, in which case the pawn drops or worse. And if the rook moves, then just d6, grabbing more space. And of course, if now this, just d7, and if ever trades off, the king wins pawns and the game. We're now a pawn up and about to be 2, and indeed an extra queen. And if they don't capture on d7, then what are you going to do? You have to give way once again. Just simply move, and once again, of course, the black rook cannot move, and if once again goes back, f5 also drops. So black's in total zugzwang if in this specific position the knight takes the rook. It does not, and Ding saw that. Being the world champion, of course, their rooking games are absolutely impeccable. For both players, that is. And after knight e7, well, suddenly king f6, and we're seeing that dark square strategy where perhaps here knight c8 might have been a decent shot to just blockade the dark squares, really make safe these this pawn blockade. Very hard to push the pawns if there's a knight on d6. For example, bishop e2, knight d6. This is the problem with Ding's position. The pawns are definitely more of a weakness than a strength, but without the bishop pair on the dark squares, maybe black can, as they're starting to do, block such attacks. The game would continue here, but white is firmly in the driver's seat. However, if we go back to this moment here after king f6, rook d4, both players were getting a little bit low on time, and a few minutes left. h6 was played. On move 39, king f1, and finally king e5. Another moment where if Ding, again, played knight c8, knight d6, just solidifying the defense of the dark squares, protecting all his pawns, dare I say an octopus knight, digging in deep and just defending, that would have been a very resilient and tough defense. But Ding, on his 40th move, played king e5. And now, rook h4 on move 41, both players having an extra 30 minutes now with a 30-second increment per move. Every time they press their clock, they gain 30 seconds. Now, Gukesh targeted h6, trading off the d5 pawn for the h6 pawn, and this is a very important transformation. White has a very big advantage now, just from a few moments ago, where knights like stability, they like to sit tight and not have to deal with a passed h-pawn on the other side of the board. But after rook h4, expertly seen by Gukesh, allowed by king e5, black has to deal with a passed h-pawn, which that knight does not enjoy. It helps the white is also a pawn up, but it's very important that it's a passed pawn. So this passed pawn was blocked, but knights really detest wing pawns. They find it very tough to defend this. And of course, even if you set up a good knight on, say, g6, then there's issues on the other side of the board as well. And it can be bullied around, bishop h5, etc. and the pawn h5. So after this trade-off, pawn for pawn, knight c3, attacking b5, rook c6, threatening a fork, so not possible to capture. Just to show that this is covered, there's no block. So the knight would drop and Ding would have resigned immediately. Now, knight e4, and, well, if Gukesh had played h4, then they've both got 25 minutes. As Yessa Sarawan likes to say, push them up the board. They only become queens if you push your passed pawns, and this would have really generated a lot of issues. Probably would be having a different conversation now. Very tough to defend. The king can walk up. The rook can still target this square. The bishop can defend the pawn. And white can just sit on a very pleasant position where black has to defend two flanks. And with a knight versus bishop, that's very hard to... Having one long-range piece is very tough to negate two long-range pieces. Especially when you have two kind of floods, so to speak, coming in. As it was... Gukesh made a king e1 move, just changing any of these forks, which once again probably wouldn't have worked, and in the subsequent endgames. And, well, elicited a quite big blunder almost by Ding. Not so much on the board, but because he used 22 minutes. There is no extra time, no second guillotine time, and that means that White Gukesh has 17 minutes more time than Ding at this moment, and Ding has a very tricky position to defend. And Gukesh now played h4. Now, at this moment, Ding was getting visibly uncomfortable. 5 minutes left, now with an increment, but still. He played rook d3 very quickly, and after bishop d1, threatening bishop c2 feels like a very, very good idea, instead of the king e2 trapping the bishop. But after bishop d1, Ding Liren very resiliently played the move f4, getting counterplay against this. And it looks like, at this moment, Ding has steadied the ship. After the semi-forced, because that pawn is under a lot of pressure, semi-forced captures. Well, it was later clarified that very probably after rook c4, Gukesh had missed that rook h3 is a fantastic resource, and feel free to pause the video and try to find the answer of why does f3 not win a knight. Of course, if they defend, then we are simply winning. However, Ding had relied on the fact that instead of obviously defending, rook h1 check would have saved the day with a threefold repetition, and well done if you found it, because if king back, then it's a twofold. There's no escaping. The king covering these squares, and you can see that there's only one other option besides going backwards. And if you do go to d3, the only other option, rook d2 would have been a very premature conclusion to this game, and Ding would have been an entire point up. Of course, Gukesh saw that, realized he'd very likely missed that after this pin does not work, and so instead did not play f3 and played bishop c2, attacking this. And after rook d5, suddenly it's very, very tricky. For example, if rook c4, what was played in the game, then f5, and if f3, well, the king can just take, and possibly confusing lines in the headspace here, because it's worth noting at this moment, Gukesh had got very, very low on time, under 1 minute. And after rook c4, f5, all seen on the board, suddenly Ding has saved his position. It is now dead level from almost losing with the passed h-pawn. Having gotten counterplay against this pawn chain, suddenly the pawns are trading off, and perhaps the best hope for Gukesh was a rook and bishop versus a rook position if he manages to win the knight for a pawn. Let's see if he managed it. That would be a theoretical draw, but sometimes very, very tricky. One of the harder ones to hold. Rook and minor piece versus rook. King g2 after bishop d1 check. And unfortunately for Gukesh, he tried rook b3 very low on time as well. The tables have very much turned in the past few moves. Seeing possibly what he'd missed, well, suddenly Gukesh had burnt some time to try and see the best way forwards. Getting very low on time, almost dangerously so. He tried f4, attacking the rook. And after rook e7, defending, well, Ding, the momentum was with him. He'd suddenly made progress. Very likely he could feel that he had saved the draw. There's a lot of discovered checks. Of course, none of them work right now because this happens and it's now losing. So rook e7 sensible. And these pawns, potentially very vulnerable. Under lock and key, black's active rook, active knight. And this bishop has no targets anymore. There's only one pawn it can attack. And meanwhile, this knight is obviously very, very superb. And that's before you get to the fact that black's king, having just craftily come up the board to the g2 square, is now destabilizing the white king side. So all of black's pieces have hugely improved from having a knight stuck on f8 and a king pinioned in the king side over here. Obviously, there's a huge improvement to black's position. The game fizzled out from here after rook e3. Essentially, both players knowing that if the last tactical trick, bishop to f3, Then king g3, attacking this. And the problem is king takes f4. And even if the final tactic of bishop takes, you do not take the rook, that would be very losing. You simply take the bishop. And this is a totally drawn rook and pawn endgame. White's king is miles away from the help of this pawn, and this pawn, in the meantime, is just dropping. There's no way to defend it comfortably, or at least no way to defend both of them comfortably. For that reason, that was the last real trick. This is trading off fast to a completely drawn ending, which, despite Gukesh's attempts of h5, knight f6 was played, and even the distant hope the knight to g3 just attacking. The king is now set free. After rook b7, you cannot defend this pawn and keep the king trapped. And so the bishop's potential use of both sides of the board, well, there's nothing there anymore. Black's king and knight herd the pawns. Finally, knight to d6 on the dark squares is seen. King e5, total dark square domination. And from here, the pawn is traded, and the rooks were fast coming off. Rook d6. And after knight d6, the pawn was captured. Pawn a6, and it was traded off to a draw. So a peaceful conclusion, but one that doesn't really encapsulate the entire game. From even the opening, there were really complicated moments throughout where, from the bishop pair having been won by a completely dynamic position, White was threatening to trap the queen, and Ding had really got into hot water. His knight was a bit trapped, his queen not exactly happy. And Gukesh really was willing to push the boat out and go for it and sacrifice a pawn. So very well played to both players. Ding, of course, despite the pressure, held the draw. And so it is 3.5 out of the first 7 games. Let's see what happens in game 8. Hope you enjoyed that. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Cheers.